Hello my friends and welcome back to my channel. After the latest update for Starfield, where we have now finally a 60 FPS and also on capable 120Hz screens a 40 FPS option, I was wondering what is going on with HDR. Has it improved since the last update, or is it still just on an average level? And the answer is, unfortunately, very simple. No, nothing has improved since the last update. We are still just on an average level. That doesn't mean that HDR looks bad, or that doesn't mean that I would not recommend to use HDR over SDR, but in regards of the HDR implementation in Starfield, we are very far away from reference level. And of course I can explain why. Let's start with the black level floor. The black level floor in Starfield is still raised, even after a lot of patches and a lot of complaints from many people. There was no improvement so far. It is not as bad as it was in the very beginning when the game was released, but it's still not on an okay level. In my opinion, this is one of the biggest downsides in Starfield when we're talking about the HDR implementation. And the next downside is that this game just outputs maximum 1000 nits in specular highlights. Even you set the HDR system level calibration on the Xbox, which is supported by this game, to the maximum 10,000 nits, the game still just outputs 1000 nits. This makes it actually very obvious that we just talking about an very simple auto HDR implementation in Starfield. And then we still have the issue or design decision that not all specular highlights are reaching 1000 nits maximum peak brightness. I understand, of course, that not all specular highlights should reach maybe 1000 nits, but in this game it's very obvious. Sometimes you just miss out maximum peak brightness and it makes the game actually looks flat compared to a proper implemented HDR game. Let's just quickly talk about the HDR settings, what we have in the game. We have the brightness setting, we have contrast setting, we have the HDR brightness setting and the HDR calibration setting. The HDR calibration option in this game will just open up the HDR system level calibration on your Xbox, and you should set up this option or this menu as required or as instructed on the screen. But again, please keep in mind, Starfield just outputs maximum 1000 nits in specular highlights. And then we have brightness and contrast setting, and I still strongly recommend do not touch those settings. Brightness should be left at 2.4 and contrast at 0. And last but not least, we have the HDR brightness setting, and as far as I know, the standard factory setting is 0.8, but I would strongly recommend increase this to 1.0 or 1 to actually have the maximum brightness in specular highlights. Okay my friends, so that's it for this very quick and short video. Nothing has improved in regards of HDR, but I still would actually recommend to use HDR over SDR on a proper screen, because it is just better than SDR, because we still have a higher maximum peak brightness compared to SDR. And yes, the HDR black level floor is slightly lifted and not perfect, but you shouldn't have too much of an issue with it. So my recommendation is still use HDR if you like it. SDR is okay in this game, but HDR, even with the downsides, still better.